My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 34 years old. And until 3 weeks ago, I worked as a mechanic in a small repair shop outside town. I wasn't rich. I wasn't successful like my older brother, Ethan. And according to most of my family, I was the disappointment of the Harper name. But none of them knew the truth about why my father trusted me more than anyone else. Before I start, take 1 second to like and subscribe. Stories like this aren't just about revenge. They're about the moments that change a person forever. Now, let me tell you what happened the day my own brother threw me out of our father's funeral. The rain started before sunrise. Cold drops slid down the church windows while black umbrellas crowded the entrance like shadows. People whispered in soft voices, pretending to mourn the man they barely respected while he was alive. My father, Richard Harper, had been one of the wealthiest businessmen in our county. He owned construction companies, properties, and enough money to make greedy relatives suddenly remember they loved him. But me? I loved him long before the money mattered. Even after he lost everything for a while. Even after the family turned their backs on him years ago. I stood near the back of the church in a simple black suit I could barely afford. My hands were shaking, but not because of the cold. I still couldn't believe he was gone. A heart attack. That's what the doctors said. Fast. Unexpected. Final. I lowered my eyes toward the wooden coffin at the front of the church, and memories hit me so hard it almost hurt to breathe. Dad teaching me how to fix engines when I was 12. Dad staying up all night with me after Mom died. Dad quietly slipping grocery money into my jacket when my repair shop salary wasn't enough. He never cared that I wasn't successful. To him, loyalty mattered more than money. Unfortunately, Ethan believed the opposite. Daniel. I looked up and saw my older brother walking toward me through the crowd. Perfect black suit, expensive watch, fake tears. Ethan Harper always looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Tall, confident, polished, the kind of man people trusted instantly, until they really knew him. You actually came, he said quietly. I frowned. He was my father, too. Ethan glanced around before stepping closer. You should leave before you embarrass yourself. I stared at him. What? You heard me. His voice hardened. People are asking questions already. What questions? About your debts, your failed business attempts, the fact you borrowed money from Dad for years. My jaw tightened. That's none of their business. It becomes their business when they see you standing here pretending you cared. For a second, I honestly thought I misheard him. Pretending? I clenched my fists. I took care of him when nobody else did. Ethan smirked slightly. You mean when you needed money? That sentence hit harder than I expected, because Ethan wasn't there during the hard years. When Dad lost millions after bad investments. When fake friends disappeared. When relatives stopped answering calls. I was there. Me, not Ethan. But nobody in that church knew the full story. And Ethan liked it that way. I'm warning you, he whispered. Don't create a scene today. Before I could answer, our Aunt Melissa suddenly walked over. Oh, Ethan, she said loudly, ignoring me completely. The lawyer arrived. Of course, the lawyer. That was the real reason half these people came. Not grief. Money. Inheritance. I watched Ethan straighten his tie instantly. The grieving son act disappeared for half a second, replaced by greed. That told me everything. The funeral service began 20 minutes later. The priest spoke about kindness, legacy, and family unity. Family unity. I almost laughed, because while everyone bowed their heads pretending to mourn, Ethan spent most of the service whispering to relatives and checking his phone. Then came the moment that changed everything. As people slowly stood to leave the church, Ethan suddenly grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. We need to talk outside. I pulled my arm away. Not now. Yes, now. The anger in his eyes caught me off guard. He dragged me toward the church entrance while several relatives watched silently. Outside, rain poured across the parking lot. "What is your problem?" I snapped. "My problem," Ethan hissed, "is that Dad changed during the last few months. And I know it was because of you." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "The will." My stomach tightened. "I don't know anything about the will." "Stop lying." "I'm not lying." Ethan stepped closer until his face was inches from mine. "If you manipulated him." "I manipulated him." I laughed bitterly. "You ignored him for years." His expression darkened instantly. Then suddenly, in front of relatives walking outside the church, Ethan pointed toward the parking lot. "Get out." I stared at him. "What?" "You heard me. Leave the funeral." Even the people nearby froze. "A funeral isn't your property." I said quietly, "It is now." The silence around us became unbearable. Rain hammered the pavement, while family members pretended not to watch. Then Ethan delivered the sentence that broke something inside me. "Dad was ashamed of you before he died." My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe, and for the first time in my life, I saw pure hatred in my brother's eyes. I stood there in the rain, staring at my brother like he had become a stranger overnight. Maybe he already was. The parking lot had gone completely silent. Even the distant thunder seemed quieter than the tension between us. Family members stood near the church doors pretending not to listen, but I could feel their eyes burning into me. "Ashamed of you before he died." Those words kept echoing in my head. My father had many flaws, but one thing he never did was make me feel unwanted. Even during arguments, even during hard times, he always spoke to me with honesty. So hearing Ethan say that felt wrong. Fake. Cruel. But the worst part, a small piece of me still wondered if it was true. I swallowed hard and looked at him. "You're lying." Ethan crossed his arms. "Believe whatever helps you sleep at night. You think throwing me out will make you look powerful?" "No," he said coldly. "It'll make this funeral respectable." That sentence hit harder than I expected. Before I could respond, Aunt Melissa suddenly stepped between us. "Boys, stop this right now," she whispered nervously. "People are watching." Ethan instantly changed his expression, like flipping a switch. His face softened. His shoulders relaxed. Suddenly he looked like the calm, grieving son again. I hated how good he was at pretending. "I'm only trying to avoid drama," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Today is about our father." I almost laughed. The performance was unbelievable. "You know what?" I said quietly. "You're right." Ethan looked surprised. "I'll leave." A few relatives exchanged awkward glances. Maybe they expected screaming. Maybe they wanted entertainment. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded letter Dad had given me 2 weeks before he died. I stared at it for a moment, then slipped it back into my jacket. "Not yet." Without another word, I turned and walked toward my old pickup truck while rain soaked through my suit. Nobody stopped me. Not one person. And honestly, that hurt more than Ethan's insults. I drove for almost an hour without knowing where I was going. The windshield wipers moved back and forth while memories flooded my mind like ghosts refusing to leave. Dad, sitting beside me in the garage late at night. Dad coughing more during the last few months. Dad asking strange questions. "Daniel, if people show you who they really are, promise me you won't ignore it." At the time, I thought he was talking about business partners. Now, I wasn't so sure. My phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. "Hello, Mr. Harper?" A calm voice asked. "Yes." "This is Margaret Wells from Anderson and Pike Law Firm." I immediately recognized the name. Dad's lawyers. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. There will be a private family reading of your father's will tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I frowned. Why are you telling me? Ethan made it pretty clear I'm not welcome. There was a short silence. Then the lawyer said something unexpected. Your father specifically requested your presence. I felt my heartbeat slow. What? He left detailed instructions before his passing. She continued. And one instruction was very clear. All beneficiaries must be present. Beneficiaries. Plural. I stared at the rain-covered road ahead. I don't understand. I can't discuss details over the phone, Mr. Harper, but I strongly advise you to attend. The call ended a minute later, but I sat there motionless for several seconds. Dad specifically requested your presence. Why? What had he done? And why was Ethan so terrified? That night, I barely slept, stayed in my tiny apartment above the repair shop, sitting beside the kitchen window with Dad's letter in my hands. I had read it at least 20 times already. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I ran out of time. There are truths this family buried years ago. I protected certain people because I thought it would keep peace in the family. I was wrong. Tomorrow, listen carefully. And no matter what happens, do not leave that room. Dad, my chest tightened again. What truths? What was he talking about? At 9:30 the next morning, I parked outside Anderson and Pike Law Firm downtown. The building looked cold and expensive. Exactly the kind of place Ethan loved. Black luxury cars lined the street, including Ethan's silver Bentley. Of course, he arrived early. I took a deep breath before walking inside. The receptionist gave me a nervous smile. They're waiting upstairs. As the elevator climbed higher, my stomach twisted harder with every second. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. When the doors opened, I saw almost the entire family already seated inside a massive conference room. Aunt Melissa, Uncle Robert, two cousins, and Ethan sitting at the head of the table like he already owned everything. The second he saw me, his expression darkened. You've got some nerve showing up. Before I could answer, a sharp voice interrupted him. Actually, said Margaret Wells, stepping into the room with several folders in her hands, your father insisted that Daniel attend. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. That reaction didn't escape me. Interesting. The lawyer sat down calmly. Before we begin, she said, there are several personal statements from Richard Harper that must be read exactly as written. Ethan leaned back impatiently. Can we skip the dramatic part and move to asset division? Margaret looked directly at him. No. The room fell silent. Then she opened the first folder. Richard Harper's final declaration. I don't know why, but suddenly I had a terrible feeling my life was about to change forever. The entire conference room went silent as Margaret Wells adjusted her glasses and opened the folder in front of her. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows behind us, but nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Ethan stopped pretending to look relaxed. Margaret cleared her throat. Richard Harper requested that this statement be read exactly as written and without interruption. She unfolded a sheet of paper. Then she began reading. If all of you are sitting in this room, then I am gone. And if Ethan is already trying to rush through this meeting, then some things never change. A few relatives shifted awkwardly. Ethan's face hardened instantly. I almost smiled for the first time in days. That sounded exactly like Dad. Margaret continued. Before I divide my estate, there are truths this family has ignored for far too long. Some people in this room loved me only when I was successful. Others stayed beside me when I had nothing. The room became heavier with every word. And slowly, I noticed several people avoiding eye contact with me. Interesting. For years, I allowed appearances to matter more than loyalty. That mistake cost this family its honesty. Ethan leaned forward impatiently. Can we get to the point already? Margaret looked up sharply. Your father specifically wrote that any interruption would delay inheritance distribution by 30 days. That shut him up immediately. I looked away to hide my reaction. Dad really planned this carefully. Margaret continued reading. When my businesses collapsed 8 years ago, almost everyone abandoned me. My chest tightened because I remembered those years clearly. The lawsuits, the debt collectors, the headlines calling Dad a failure. Back then, Ethan disappeared almost completely. He claimed he was protecting his career, but everyone knew the truth. He didn't want to be associated with failure. Meanwhile, I spent nearly every night helping Dad sort paperwork in his garage office while creditors threatened to take everything. And suddenly, Margaret read the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Only one person remained loyal to me during those years: Daniel. The room went still. I looked down at the table quietly. While others protected their reputations, my younger son protected me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan's jaw tighten. But Margaret wasn't finished. For that reason, Daniel already knows the truth about how Harper Construction survived. My head snapped upward. What? I stared at the lawyer in confusion. I didn't know any truth. Ethan immediately spoke. What does that mean? Margaret ignored him and continued. 8 years ago, when the company was collapsing, someone secretly sold their inheritance shares to save the business. My heartbeat slowed. No, no way. I suddenly remembered something. A conversation in Dad's garage years ago. Him asking strange questions about sacrifice, about loyalty, about family. And then the memory hit me like lightning. My college fund. The account Dad said disappeared during the bankruptcy crisis. I felt cold all over. Margaret looked directly at me. Your father included legal documentation confirming that your inheritance trust was liquidated with your written permission at age 26. The room exploded with confusion. What? Aunt Melissa whispered. Ethan looked furious. That's impossible. But it wasn't, because suddenly I remembered signing papers Dad begged me to trust him with years ago. Back then he promised he would explain someday. I never asked questions because I trusted him. And now I finally understood. My college fund hadn't disappeared. I gave it to save the company. The same company Ethan spent years bragging about rebuilding. I leaned back slowly, stunned. Dad never told anyone, not even me. Margaret continued. Daniel sacrificed his future without hesitation while others protected their lifestyles. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. The lawyer calmly opened another folder. It's fully documented. She slid copies across the table. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Bank transfers, legal signatures, my signature. Every dollar from my inheritance trust had gone into Harper Construction during the bankruptcy crisis. And suddenly the timeline made sense. A few months after that transfer, the company recovered. Dad rebuilt everything. And Ethan stepped in later, claiming he helped save the family empire. The room became painfully quiet. My cousin stared at Ethan differently now, not with admiration, with suspicion. Ethan noticed it too. This proves nothing, he snapped. I spent years expanding the company afterward. Margaret nodded calmly. Yes, your father addressed that as well. Ethan froze. Margaret opened the final folder, slowly. And for the first time since I arrived, I saw actual fear in my brother's eyes. To my eldest son, Ethan, she read, "You inherited my ambition, but unfortunately, you also inherited my worst qualities." Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. You cared more about owning the Harper name than protecting it. Ethan stood up suddenly. I'm done listening to this. Sit down, Margaret said sharply. You can't force me. Yes, actually I can. Because if you leave before the reading is complete, you automatically surrender your inheritance rights under your father's legal instructions. That hit him like a bullet. He slowly sat back down, furious, humiliated, trapped, and deep inside, I realized Dad had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Then Margaret turned the page. Now we will begin the official division of the Harper estate. The air in the room changed instantly, because everyone knew this was the moment that truly mattered. Money, power, ownership, and somehow I had a terrifying feeling Ethan wasn't about to get what he expected. The silence inside the conference room became unbearable. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Not Aunt Melissa, not Uncle Robert, and definitely not Ethan, the confident businessman who threw me out of Dad's funeral yesterday, now looked tense for the first time in his life. Margaret Wells placed both hands calmly on the table. We will now proceed with the official inheritance distribution of Richard Harper's estate. Every eye in the room locked onto her. Even I felt nervous, not because I expected money. Honestly, after everything that happened, I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to understand why Dad kept so many secrets. Margaret opened another folder. To extended family members, she began, Richard Harper left personal gifts and fixed financial amounts already outlined in Appendix B. Aunt Melissa relaxed instantly. Of course, that was all they truly cared about. Margaret continued reading figures, properties, and trust payments while relatives nodded quietly. Then came the important part, the ownership division of Harper Construction and associated business assets. Ethan straightened immediately. There it was, the real prize. The company was worth millions now. Everyone knew Ethan expected complete control. He had acted like CEO for years, even though Dad technically remained majority owner until his death. Margaret read carefully. To my eldest son, Ethan Harper, I leave 15% ownership of Harper Construction. The room froze. Ethan blinked. What? Margaret continued calmly, as if nothing happened. This includes executive compensation, rights already defined within the company structure. No, Ethan snapped loudly. Read that again. Margaret looked up slowly. I assure you, Mr. Harper, I read it correctly. You're lying. She slid a document toward him. Signed, notarized, official. Ethan grabbed the papers violently while his face drained of color. 15%, he whispered. For years, Ethan acted like the company belonged to him. But 15%, that wasn't control. That wasn't even close. Aunt Melissa looked confused. Then who owns the rest? Margaret turned another page, and suddenly, my stomach tightened, because I already knew the answer before she said it. To my son Daniel Harper, I leave 60% ownership of Harper Construction, including controlling authority over all corporate decisions. The room exploded. What? That's impossible. Daniel. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even process what I just heard. 60%. Controlling ownership. Me? Ethan shot to his feet so fast his chair slammed backward onto the floor. No. His voice echoed across the room. This is fraud. Margaret remained perfectly calm. Everything has been legally verified. He's a mechanic. Ethan shouted while pointing at me. He knows nothing about running a company. The humiliation in his voice shocked even the relatives. Like the idea of me having power physically disgusted him. I slowly looked up at my brother, and suddenly I realized something painful. He never saw me as family. Not really. To him, I was always the embarrassment he tolerated, the failure standing beside his success. Margaret spoke again. Your father included additional written instructions regarding control of the company. She opened another envelope. Daniel may choose whether Ethan remains employed within Harper Construction. The room went dead silent. Ethan stared at her, then at me, then back at her again. Pure panic entered his eyes, because for the first time in his life, He wasn't in control anymore. "This is insane," he whispered. But Margaret wasn't finished. "If Ethan attempts legal action against this decision, his inheritance percentage will automatically reduce from 15% to 5. That ended everything. Even Ethan knew fighting would destroy him financially. He slowly sat back down, breathing heavily. I had never seen him look weak before. Never. Margaret turned toward me gently. "There's one final instruction from your father addressed specifically to you, Mr. Harper." My throat tightened. She handed me a sealed envelope. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then the truth is finally in the open. I know this responsibility will scare you. That's why I chose you. Not because you're perfect, because you're kind. Ethan understands business, but you understand people. And a man who values loyalty over power will always protect what truly matters. You once gave up your future to save this family without asking for recognition. I never forgot that. There's one more truth you deserve to know. The night before my heart attack, Ethan asked me to remove you completely from the will. That's when I realized I had failed him as a father. Do not hate your brother, but never trust him blindly again. I love you, son, Dad." My vision blurred instantly. I looked down, trying to hide the emotion hitting me like a wave. The night before his heart attack, Ethan tried to erase me. Suddenly, yesterday's funeral made sense. The insults, the anger, the panic. He thought Dad changed the will because of me, but Dad changed it because of him. I slowly folded the letter. The room stayed completely silent. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "You manipulated him." I looked up. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller than my brother. "You still don't get it," I said softly. His jaw tightened. "Get what?" Dad wasn't rewarding me for being successful. I stood slowly. He was rewarding me for staying. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And the expression on Ethan's face told me something important. This wasn't over. Not even close. Nobody said a word after that. The tension inside the conference room felt heavy enough to crush the walls around us. Ethan sat motionless at the far end of the table, staring at the documents in front of him, like they were written in another language. For the first time in his life, he had lost not just money, control, power, pride, and judging by the hatred building in his eyes, he still couldn't accept it. Margaret Wells slowly organized the remaining paperwork while relatives awkwardly gathered their things. One by one, they avoided looking at me directly. Funny, isn't it? Yesterday, I was the family embarrassment. Today, they suddenly didn't know how to speak to me. Aunt Melissa forced a nervous smile. "Daniel, your father clearly thought very highly of you." I looked at her calmly. "Did he?" Her smile faded instantly, because we both knew the truth. Most of them ignored Dad during his hardest years. Now, they wanted to rewrite history because money was involved. Typical. Within minutes, the room slowly emptied until only 3 people remained. Me, Ethan, and Margaret. The lawyer stood carefully. "I'll give you both a moment." Then she quietly left the conference room, closing the door behind her. Silence. Ethan still wouldn't look at me. I should have felt victorious. But honestly, I just felt tired. Tried to remove me from the will? I finally asked quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, slowly. "You were never supposed to see that letter." "That's not an answer." His jaw tightened. "You want the truth," he snapped. "Fine." For the first time since childhood, my brother looked completely honest, raw, angry, broken. "I spent my entire life fixing Dad's mistakes," he said bitterly. "When the company collapsed, who rebuilt the reputation? Me. Who brought investors back? Me. Who spent years making Harper Construction respected again?" "You did," I admitted. "Exactly," he shouted. "And then he hands everything to you?" I looked at him quietly because I stayed when there was nothing left. Ethan laughed bitterly. You think loyalty pays bills? No, I said softly. But it matters. His eyes darkened. You always wanted to be the good son. That's not true. Yes, it is. He slammed his fist onto the table. Dad looked at you like you were some kind of hero while I carried the pressure of this family for years. I stared at him, and suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Ethan wasn't just greedy. He was hurt. For years, he believed Dad loved me more. And maybe Dad spent so much time admiring my loyalty that he forgot Ethan needed love too. That didn't excuse what Ethan did, but it explained it. You know what the saddest part is? Ethan said quietly, I actually thought Dad would finally choose me in the end. I swallowed hard, because despite everything, part of me felt sorry for him. He spent his whole life chasing approval he never believed he earned. And now the only person whose approval mattered was gone forever. Ethan stood slowly and grabbed his coat. So what now? He asked coldly. You fire me? I looked at the ownership papers in front of me. One signature from me could destroy his career, humiliate him, make him feel exactly the way he made me feel at the funeral. For a moment, the temptation was real. Then I remembered Dad's letter. Do not hate your brother. I took a slow breath. You're staying. Ethan frowned. What? You helped rebuild the company. Dad was right about that. Suspicion filled his face immediately. You expect me to be grateful? No, I said calmly. I expect you to stop treating people like they matter less than money. He stared at me silently. You'll still have your position, I continued, but things change from now on. What things? I looked directly into his eyes. We run the company together. His expression hardened instantly. Absolutely not. Then walk away. The room became silent again, because deep down, Ethan knew something important. Without Harper Construction, most of his identity disappeared. Finally, he spoke. You really think this fixes everything? No, I admitted. Some things stay broken. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then slowly, Ethan picked up his chair and placed it upright again. Not an apology, not forgiveness, but maybe a beginning. 3 months later, Harper Construction changed more than anyone expected. I reopened employee health care programs Dad once cut during the financial crisis. We increased salaries for longtime workers. And for the first time in years, employees stopped fearing upper management. Shockingly, Ethan adapted too. Not immediately, but little by little. Sometimes I'd catch him about to insult an employee before stopping himself halfway through. Other times I noticed him staying late to help teams instead of barking orders. People can change. Not perfectly, but enough. One evening after work, I visited Dad's grave alone. The sunset painted the cemetery gold while cold wind moved through the trees. I placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and stood there quietly for a long time. You really planned all this, huh? I whispered, for the first time since his death. I smiled, because finally I understood what Dad wanted. The inheritance was never about money. It was a test, not of intelligence, not of business skill, of character. And in the end, the son who stayed mattered more than the son who succeeded. Thanks for listening to my story. If this touched you in any way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Sometimes the people who seem weakest are the ones carrying the entire family on their shoulders. And sometimes loyalty becomes the greatest inheritance of all.